Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to another GIBS forum. It's great to have you with us once again. It's wonderful having the technology to connect to all of you, and looking forward to a great discussion. Of course, we are here to enjoy the launch of a new book that's come out, Rescue from Global Crisis to a Better World, written by UK-based South African Ian Goldin. This book is a tour de force of some of the major challenges facing us at a global level, and really in some ways a call to action in a post-COVID world. But I'm not going to tell you too much about the book. We have a wonderful partner here in our fellow host this afternoon, Trevor Manuel. Our two guests really need no introduction, but let me take the time to talk a little bit about them. Of course, you will know Trevor Manuel has held various positions in the leadership of South Africa, from cabinet minister under multiple presidents, Mandela, Mbeki, and Motlanthe, all the way through to President Zuma, former parliamentarian, and of course, Minister of Finance for many, many years, Minister in the Presidency, Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. Before that, and during those times, involved at the Africa Development Bank, serving in the World Bank Development Committee, as well as the Africa Commission at the IMF. And so really a wonderful guest. And then, of course, with Trevor this afternoon, Ian Goldin, Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford, Professorial Fellow at the Ballion College, and the former founder and leader of or director of the Oxford Martin School Interdisciplinary Research Unit at the school. And as you might know, Ian spent some time before that in South Africa as a cabinet minister, and an advisor to the president, or in fact, not a cabinet minister, as the chief executive of the Development Bank, advisor to President Mandela. And so it's rare that you have two minds of the intellectual capacity as we have this afternoon, but not only that, two individuals with the wide-ranging institutional leadership experience as we have this afternoon. And so in conversation this afternoon, Trevor Manuel and Ian Goldin on his new book, From Global Crisis to a Better World. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Trevor. Before I do that, one more housekeeping point, and that is that, colleagues, the chat function is open for your questions throughout the discussion. Please make a point of using the chat to post your questions. We will field them and hear from you. And then also thank you at the start here to our event partners, Jonathan Ball Publishers and Exclusive Books. It's great to have you all with us in the room. And so I'm going to hand over to Trevor. Trevor, if you'd like to take us into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Marius. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Ian, thanks for this, formerly your 20th book. It's an amazing contribution. I think that to have taken all of the themes that you have and woven them together in these 321 pages that runs in a kind of continuous style is a tour de force. And so thank you very much for that. I just want to make a point that I've been very impressed with the easy style in which it's written, but for the verifiability of all of the facts that you present. I shared with you earlier that there are 671 end notes in it. So it's not, you can check his thumbs, they are not sucked. There's a lot in there. I want to ask you in a moment about how you hope this book will be used, because I think it's quite important to draw on your perspective. But I also want to just I think in the book you framed the discussion by drawing on what Nobel laureate Angus Deaton said about the present conjuncture, and he says, "We now face a set of challenges which we cannot duck, which threatens the fabric of society, providing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle disadvantages faced by many that the pandemic has so devastatingly exposed." And I think that captures it, and that it's that kind of sense that Angus Deaton brings that you've tried to elaborate over the many pages. I want to start by inviting you to tell us a bit about the book from your perspective before trying to converse about some of the themes.
Ian, you're on mute still.
This will be the refrain of this pandemic. Thanks very much, Trevor, and thanks to GIBS for hosting this. You know, Trevor, it really is a huge pleasure for me to have this conversation with you, not only because I admire you enormously and think that you have the range of knowledge which this book tries to embody, but because I've learned so much from you. And of course, what participants may know is that I used to call Trevor governor because he was the governor of the DBSA when I was the chief executive there. But now I just think about him as a very wise and very good friend, and a friend of South Africa and the world, for a better world. The reason I did this book was because I'm absolutely convinced that we're at a potential inflection point in human history. The terrible, terrible suffering, and I'm sure all the participants know people that have lost their lives, family members that have suffered, and everyone suffered in some way, socially and others. And of course, many people are dying of starvation and hunger around the world because of this and have been forced into poverty. If all of this suffering is not in vain, in some sense, we can say that this pandemic has been a portal to a better world. Crises always affect the poorest, the worst, whatever the crises. And this one is no different. It has exacerbated so much which is wrong with the world, but it's also revealed very starkly so much that is wrong. My nightmare is that we bounce back onto the road we were on, which is leading us over a precipice. My nightmare is in language of reset, which implies we go back to the operating system we had before, which is the operating system which has given us the pandemic, which is giving us rising inequality, which is giving us all the bads. But there is a different potential, and that's the potential which I explore in the book on all the different dimensions that I look at, the 14 different dimensions, that this really is the wake-up call, that this is our Second World War, not our First World War. The First World War, as participants will know, was meant to be the war that ended all wars. That's what H.G. Wells said, and many others. But it just led to a downward spiral. And then the roaring 20s of a century ago were not only a celebration of the end of a pandemic, the Spanish flu, and the war, but they were the view that we could renormalize by consuming, by simply carrying on. And that was the disaster that led to the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and protectionism, and an even worse war. But in the Second World War, people did finally wake up. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, Trevor, but it's the recognition that these crises are these moments of opportunity. You know, the Greek word apocalypse means unveiling, the unveiling. And the question is this pandemic going to be this? It certainly, for many, has been apocalyptic, but is it going to be an unveiling? Is it going to allow us to do things differently in the future? The jury's out, but unless one argues for it, it's not going to happen. Unless one wants it to happen, it's not going to happen. And that's why I did the book, because I want desperately to create a different world, and that to help others who are thinking about it to think these issues through. And if the book serves that purpose, it would have been the work I put into it.
Thank you very much, Ian. Let's just take forward the theme that you raise, and that is what emerges from World War II. And it's important to just set that as context, because in 1944, with the war still on, perhaps the dying embers of the war, there are important meetings about setting the frame for what is beyond the war. And so you have a meeting in San Francisco that converts the League of Nations into the United Nations and sets it up. And there's a conference at Bretton Woods to look at the global economic system, where they agree on three important institutions: a bank for reconstruction and development, a monetary fund, and an international trade organization, which doesn't get born for 50 years because the US Senate won't approve it. But the two other institutions were born then. And we can look at this now and ask a series of questions about the appropriateness of these organizations, ask about the UN and the Security Council, ask about the veto system and its impact on what's happening in the world. Look at the World Bank and IMF. And you raise a number of important themes, especially during 2020, where the IMF, that had always seemed to drag its heels on a series of issues, actually stepped up to the plate under different leadership. The IMF now asking a series of questions about a new issuance of special drawing rights, which, if properly applied, could deal with liquidity and could balance out the needs in very poor countries. Because what you also draw attention to is that China is a major lender to 73 of the world's poorest countries. So you've got that. On the other hand, the G7, when met in Carbis Bay in Cornwall a few weeks ago, set itself up almost as an anti-China forum. So the question that confronts us arising from the many issues that you draw together is, who will bell the cat? If the world recognizes that global cooperation is in our best interests, who will bell the cat? How will we bring these issues to the fore? Because one can't read rescue and not ask about the rescuing of the world and its systems.
Yeah, I was very struck, and although I think I vaguely knew of it, I hadn't really appreciated just how this new world order came into being at the absolute height of the war. Although the meeting of Bretton Woods, for example, was a year or so before the end of the war, the planning that went into it was at the height of the war. And it was, you know, in the UK, as you see, if you walk around the countryside near where I live, they actually thought they were going to be invaded. There was a real risk. Blockhouses were being built and Dad's army was being created. So it was an existential crisis going on for the country at the same time as a new world order was being created. The welfare state, Bretton Woods institutions, Marshall Plan, UN. And what I've been trying to understand is that just luck of the leaders? Is this down to Roosevelt and Churchill, and we just don't have people like that anymore? Or was there something else going on that created that moment? And I've come to the conclusion, which is an optimistic one, which is it didn't depend on those individuals, that actually those individuals to some extent were dragged into it against their will at times. And, you know, Churchill, who was the absolute war hero at the end of the war, was defeated in a landslide election by Clem Attlee, who was he makes Keir Starmer, the current leader of the opposition in the UK, seem quite dynamic and charismatic. He was a really bland character, and most people had never heard of him. And they got a landslide victory, although Churchill was the war hero. And the reason that happened was because the command of the population, the desire, was for the creation of something totally different and never to have a war again like that. And the promise to those that went off and lost their lives, and a lot of young people lost their lives. You know, my group, you look in my college in Oxford, Balliol, a third of one class lost their lives. So the promise of that was that the world would be different. And so Churchill was defeated. I suppose the South African expression is, people were hurtful with what was going on, and they voted with very strong determination for change. And we saw similar things in other countries across Europe, and a tolerance of very high levels of tax that went with it. It was also very difficult to do these conferences. Keynes was not well, and Churchill was even sicker, as well as Roosevelt. And yet they made these terribly dangerous trips across the Atlantic, danger of being shot down, because of their commitment. So there was a willingness and a determination. You asked the question of, what do we do now if we don't have that coalition for change, at least key constituencies. I think the other great lesson of that time is actually most countries weren't part of that. It was a key group of actors, including South Africa, incidentally, who were determined to make these processes happen. And it really mattered that they cared. And I think that's what we need to take away from this. And you've been participating in the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, where we talk about these creative coalitions. And in many cases, it's not countries, it's cities, it's companies, it's communities, it's different organizations that create coalitions for change. And my view is that on most of the problems that one can identify, certainly climate change, certainly financial stability, certainly global solidarity, on taxes and closing tax havens, certainly big actions on international aid. It's actually a small minority, maybe 20% of the countries that really need to do the heavy lifting. And depending what the issue is, New York State consumes more antibiotics and more energy than the whole of 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So which countries participate and which cities participate and which actors come to the table really matters. I don't think we're going to see the UK, Europe, US playing the role we had before, but that doesn't mean that things can't happen. And I think that we can be pushed, we can do many things through different coalitions that will result in the sort of change we want. Pandemics, unfortunately, are the big exception. Stopping pandemics requires all countries in the world to participate, because a pandemic can come from the poorest place on earth, but increasingly the risk is from the richest place. The US most probably posing the greatest risk of future pandemics because it has the most labs from which things could leak or be stolen or taken. And so that's really the big question. And that, I believe, we have an absolute mutuality of interest. And we'll come, I'm sure, to the question of a new Cold War, but no one has an interest in not stopping global crises.
Yeah, let's take it from that level and try and bring it home into the lives of families. There's an interesting statistic you use that the pandemic will cost the US $16 trillion now. You can multiply that by 13.77 and get the Rand figure. But you break it down further and say that it'll cost, the impact would cost $200,000 per family of 4 in the US. Now, the pandemic is not going to be without cost. Part of the impact will be felt in public finances, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But other parts of it, I think, would also be in the exacerbation of what was carried into this pandemic, which is inequality. Now, you were also able to detail that inequality is not just a set of statistics, but has features of race and class. And so how will this issue be remedied? I mean, what is the prognosis for dealing with that kind of issue? And if I can be even more particular about it, some of what you've looked at is first the impact on younger people. Now, people who are leaving tertiary institutions or school and joining the world of work are experiencing major difficulties, partly because of a combination of factors. Our generation has consumed too much of a share of resources, but also the advancements with AI mean that there are fewer jobs other than jobs in the gig economy that present. And so there's great vulnerability for people entering. So the future is certainly not very rosy. But then for people who are now entering the other end, pensions, for instance, we're looking at a situation where negative interest rates mean that accumulated savings for retirement are now greatly diminished. And so across the spectrum of family life, there's a hardship that will present in ways that didn't present when we were coming through, despite the fact that we are the last of the baby boomers and perhaps the first generation post World War II. How will these issues be unscrambled going forward?
Yeah, they're very, very tough issues, and you've pointed to a couple of the things I try and draw out in the book. One is this immense cost, and of course the US and the advanced economies, the rich economies, are tearing up their rule books and basically issuing money. They are doing this at unprecedented levels, creating debt, and in the process, the US, but globally, is over $17 trillion of stimulus, but far less than 1%. In fact, less than 0.5% of that is going to support developing countries. So you have this very, very strong exacerbation of inequality, because the rich countries are able to basically protect their firms and their people to some extent, and poor countries cannot. South Africa just cannot do what the US or European countries, other rich countries are doing. And so within countries and between countries, you get this very stark increase in inequality, and it's desperate in all countries. Countries like the UK having millions of people now depending on food banks, very strong regional inequalities, geographical inequalities, and very, very strong also race and ethnicity inequalities, not only in income, but also in health. In the UK, certain ethnic communities have something like 3 or 4 times the chance of being killed by COVID. So it's across the board. And this is certainly, obviously very, very strongly revealed in South Africa as well. The generational dimension is just another side of this. There's also a gender dimension to this, because women have done much worse than men in the pandemic on the income front for a variety of reasons. The generational dimensions are extremely strong, and my view is they are one that we have to address, because the younger generation have shown so much commitment. Young people have basically given up their social lives in lockdowns. They've given up often their education, or got in very inferior online education. Their job prospects have been greatly diminished, and they're inheriting a massive debt. And they're doing it all in order to protect elder people who have a very, very much greater chance, something like 100 or 200 or 300 times more chance of being killed by COVID. COVID is very differentiating by age. And so this sacrifice of young people, and this, again, I refer back to the sacrifice that young people made in the wars. This sacrifice of young people cannot be in vain. We have to be able to say to young people that out of this terrible pandemic will come a better future for you. But you're right to also point to the fact that it's not just young people who suffered, it's also a lot of pensioners and people approaching the end of their careers. Many people, and I've got the statistics in the book, are being forced into early retirement. Many people have lost their jobs, and therefore what they expected to save over their lifetimes has been greatly diminished. And the returns on investments have been greatly diminished through quantitative easing and very, very low interest rates. So those that have money, particularly in housing, in stock markets, have done fabulously well. Those that have been able to keep on to their jobs because they can work online like we can, have done okay. Those that have had to go to work, the essential workers, have taken a massive risk, and those that have to go to work that's been closed have laid off. And you see the statistics in South Africa. I mean, I've read data on unemployment rates for youth which are record in the world. I mean, people talk about 80–90% of some age categories unemployment. This is totally unsustainable. And so that the question you pose is what can be done about it. It's also a question of informality and formality, as you highlight. Those in the informal sector are at much greater risk because they have none of the security or income support. And in some countries, including the US, they have no health support. There's 75 million people in the US that can't access hospitals because they don't have health care. So this is an extremely wide-ranging issue. My own view is that it's got to be multifaceted, and this goes back to the heart of the program for reconstruction and development in South Africa in the immediate post-apartheid years. But it's got to be a combination of very strong redistribution, safety net, basic income. I do believe in basic incomes. What that basic income will be will depend very much on the society's affordability, plus certain guarantees of service, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's shelter. And those basic guarantees, which are in some respects embodied in the Bill of Rights in South Africa, these guarantees are, in my view, something which done. Now, most countries, the rich countries can certainly afford this. It's related to, but goes beyond the taxation discussion which the OECD and G7 are having. It needs to be much wider, much stronger than that. But it's also about international solidarity. And that's been the biggest failure of this pandemic in many respects, is that even compared to the financial crisis of 13 years ago, we've seen a terribly poor response from the G7 and the G20. Really no solidarity to speak of when it comes to income. To see Boris Johnson standing up in Cornwall talking about solidarity after he's cut the aid budget by a third was particularly galling. But very, because the size of the incomes of rich countries, the GDPs has contracted, aid has contracted at a time when it's never been more needed. And I'm sure we'll get to this, the international institutions and the credit rating agencies have compounded the problem. So this is extremely poor response. In my view, the answer is we need another big global public action campaign like the Make Poverty History campaign. We need to raise awareness and political pressure for this. It should not be happening at the international level. And of course, it's also being mirrored in the vaccines, the vaccine nationalism, which is just another aspect of this inequality with devastating consequences for poor people in poor countries.
The contrast, of course, presents in the form of the exceedingly wealthy who are multiplying their wealth. So, Jeff Bezos was the first person to accumulate 200 billion last year. In fact, he doubled his wealth in the course of 2020. Elon Musk does the same kind of thing. You can look at the families in India like the Ambanis who are multiplying their billions as well. And then you can look at the number of new billionaires in China. So whilst so many people are being impoverished, you've got the contrast. And then in the context of taxation, the people we're talking about don't contribute to tax. So the ability of states and governments to be able to deal with the quality of public services necessary to transform the issues is a major problem as well. But it does appear that there's reluctance to try and deal with it. Bernie Sanders had read out just the tax contribution of some of the wealthy Americans, and it is galling. Do you want to comment on that? But before you do, Ian, let me just, because we said that we hope that it'll be a lot more interactive, invite people to comment in the chat, and Marius will try and pick up issues from there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We have this extraordinary phenomena of extreme increases in poverty and in wealth at the same time. And the reasons for the increases in wealth are largely related to the fact that people are demanding more online services. Well, that's great for Amazon. There's been a massive push on climate change, which is good, which has been very good for Tesla. And there have been other developments in housing markets and stock markets, which have seen wealth soar. What I found particularly wrong was that there was this revelation, there was a leak, that these billionaires in the US are only paying 3% tax on average, which is far less than I'm sure anyone on this call is paying, and certainly less than working people pay. And the response of the Biden administration was to say, we'll launch an investigation into the leak, not to say this is terrible. How can this happen, and get behind the calls for more effective taxation, the closure of tax havens, the reasons why these people pay such low tax. And I think this is going to be part of a global movement as well. I think citizens are getting very angry about this. And my own view is that the tolerance for it, both on taxation of incomes, but also very significantly of wealth, is going to change. And these moods can swing very, very quickly. In Europe and North America, the average tax band at the top was 70% in the 1950s and 60s, after the Second World War. And through conservative and Democrat, progressive and right-wing governments, there was a consensus on high taxation. And then with the Thatcherite Reagan revolution, in the space of about 10 years, it went from 70% to just over 20% in terms of these average tax takes. And that was an ideological shift. My sense is that the pendulum has shifted back dramatically, publicly, and that we will see this, but it's going to require political pressure, it's going to require momentum, and it's going to require consumers to say, we will only consume things from companies that do the right thing. Jeff Bezos could have given $100,000 to all the workers in Amazon and still be richer at the end, now than he was 18 months ago. That's how much money he's earned. And of course, spending it as others are on rockets is not the same as solving the world's problems.
I want to move on to another theme, Ian, and hopefully Marius will help us in a moment. But you deal with the cities of the future, and there are a few different strands that come together. I mean, on the one hand, the sphinxes and pyramids of our generation are the glass towers called office blocks. The bulk of them are standing empty. In South Africa, we've never quite dealt with the apartheid, the spatial apartheid. And so these glass towers, frequently in high-density complexes, well, like Sandton and so on, are now standing abandoned. There are all kinds of issues that present, and I'm not raising this because anybody on this call is involved in real estate speculation. But there has to be a major change in that regard. There has to be a major change in the way in which cities function. You make the call. I think that increasingly networked services mean that the greater the compacting of these services, the lower the costs, the greater the advantages. You also draw attention to public transport. I know that you cycle around Oxford. Even when you come to Stellenbosch, you bring your bicycle. You are that kind of conscientious commuter. But what are the changes, and how might this be the trigger to deal with climate change differently?
Yeah, I wish I could get to Stellenbosch without the air miles and the carbon that produces. But
cycle.
Yeah. we'll have to sort out Africa's problems first, and the infrastructure problems. But the future of cities, which is a theme that I take up as well in rescues, is an absolutely critical question, because most of the world's inhabitants will live in cities. It's the area which has the most potential. I'm a huge believer in the dynamism of cities, the innovation of cities, the creativity of cities as the driving force of change in the world, and innovation, but also political change. And of course, they are much better than distributed, dispersed communities in terms of climate footprint, in terms of many other things, as well as the learning and dynamism that comes from it, the social support. But they can also be desperately lonely places, as I point to, and they can also have very, very serious inequalities. And whether it's Johannesburg or whether it's London, we see the greatest inequalities often within cities. And that's certainly a global phenomenon. I think this pandemic, for the reasons you indicate, has created a quite extraordinary potential to reimagine cities and cities for the future, and to accelerate our transition to them in a variety of ways. I was this morning in a conversation about the future of London, with very similar conversations about empty buildings and what can be done, and shuttered up shops all over the place, how to reimagine the high streets, how to imagine the office buildings, and to have high density living in the cities, and of course to reuse these shuttered up shops for other activities which are more community organized, which bring local production, local crafts, local jobs into being, and at the same time greatly reduce the carbon footprint. And one of the great things in a more rapid transition to clean energy is, of course, some of the places which are the noisiest and most polluted suddenly become wonderful places to be, city centers. And you can cross a road without either being run over or getting a lot of pollution, etc. So how to create that? This is an opportunity, but it does take money. And that's why I also focus on the financial dynamics of city, which I'm very, very worried about. Because as a lot of wealthy businesses and people go to the suburbs, a lot of things, the rates income of cities starts to collapse, public transport revenues start to collapse, and then we see a downward spiral. It's also the case that a lot of places where if the new jobs are going to be in new places, often in the suburbs, in wealthier suburbs, then the public transport isn't set up for it. And that's very clear in places like New York and London, for example. So this is the time, and my own view is that this is also the time for a lot of international support for this. And cities as well, of course, through these cities alliances, of which there are many, many, mayors talking to each other, can learn from each other. Some have gone much further than others. I very much like Paris's 15-minute city idea, for example. Now that 15-minute doesn't mean you have to be able to walk everywhere, but get anywhere, and often on public transport. So how we leapfrog, and in South Africa, how we use this to leapfrog beyond the apartheid geography, which we're still so stuck with, is absolutely central to the debate, and will require not only national support. The cities can't do it on their own. I think they're going to need national fiscal support, but also a lot of support in terms of concessional lending from international institutions to make this happen.
Let me just bring in the issue of politics, Ian, because I think it's quite central. Because on the one hand, you've got this populism and nationalism, and you've seen it. And I think the vaccine nationalism is a small part of that. And one of the reasons that Africa is so hard done by is because the wealthy countries have amassed and accumulated as many vaccines as they can, so that they can vaccinate people many times over, and then perhaps have a bit of charity in 2022 when everybody in the north is vaccinated. It's an unbelievable problem. You saw that there couldn't even be a concession on intellectual property for vaccine manufacture. These are major challenges, but that same nationalism plays itself out in a variety of ways. Just look at the behavior of Bolsonaro in Brazil, look at Duterte in the Philippines, Modi in India, and then you've got all of these battles with nobody capable of dealing with them. Whether you're talking of Swaziland, or as the king has renamed it, Eswatini, or Tigray, the Middle East conflict, Myanmar. There are just too many of these conflicts in the world, and a UN too divided to deal with it. The Security Council too polarized, and therefore rights of people, rights of poor people undermined. Do you just want to talk about that, its impact on the now and the future? I know that there's a question from somebody in the chat box, but
yeah, and I see my godsons in the chat box, which is wonderful, Kaya. So that's so nice to see you there, Kaya, and also to see you, Sarah. The vaccine nationalism is a scandal, and we have to ask ourselves very deep ethical questions about who we are as humans, and what our priorities are. You know, the big discussion in the UK at the moment is whether we give vaccines and keep them for teenagers who have a very low mortality risk, rather than send them abroad. And this is a similar discussion going on in the US and elsewhere. And what was agreed at the G7 in Cornwall was really token in terms of the scale of what is needed. So it's a dramatically important issue. I think the pharmaceutical companies have a massive role to play, the intellectual property question, and I'm proud of Oxford insisting with the AstraZeneca vaccine that we would not support any manufacturer that held the IP, so that IP is available. But it also points to a broader question, which is the raw materials, the manufacturing capabilities, and many other things that are required for vaccine production, which goes beyond simply the intellectual property. That requires a Manhattan Project, for those of you that know about it, the effort that unfortunately went into the creation of the atomic bomb. But the concentration of ability, and it can be done, if you tell the top 100 scientists that will give you all the resources you need to solve this problem with the sorts of leadership from business, like we're seeing in Business for South Africa. These problems can be resolved, but they require the political will to do that. And that is what's been so terribly lacking, and you point to that, Trevor. I think a massively significant issue in this is this looming Cold War that the US is leading with China. When the purpose of the G7 wasn't so much to solve the world's problems, but was to create a coalition of countries against China, even to the extent of befriending Russia in the hope, I think very naively, that somehow if you befriended the Russian bear, you would take it away from the Chinese dragon. That is, to me, the most dangerous thing, because if we go back to new Cold War politics, we cannot solve any global problem, whether it's vaccine distribution or whether it's any other, climate change or any other. And so if nothing comes of this pandemic except understanding our codependency, our mutuality, then I think we are going to be in a very grave situation. So stopping that, and I think Europe has a critical role to play, but so do countries like South Africa, who say we don't want to be the pawn in some global game. We need countries to cooperate. There are things we can disagree with very strongly, like human rights, but there are many things that we need to work together on. And that is going to be absolutely, and I think the role of a country like South Africa and President Ramaphosa is absolutely critical in this regard. in creating a coalition of countries, and certainly the President of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, and many others, I believe, would step up to an agenda which said, let's not fall into that trap. And it's a trap that the US is laying at the moment, and it's a trap that needs to be avoided, I think, at all costs to overcome these problems. But by focusing on the big issues, I think one avoids that. How are we going to solve climate change? How are we going to solve the pandemic? And one thing that certainly this Delta variant in the pandemic is teaching us is that until we stop the pandemic everywhere, we are not going to stop it anywhere. If countries don't realize that now, they'll never realize it.
If I can just try to deal with some of the questions. Owen Schweller's question deals with what happens in society, in education, and in empowering people. And one of the concerns I have about this right now is that given the extent of disruption of the environment of learning and teaching, it's actually very hard to see how this is going to work out. In South Africa, we know that children of wealthier parents have access to online learning. Children of the poor have no such access. And so all of this education and learning opportunities are being disrupted. And what that does for changing the way in which education functions. The education of Ken Robinson, as rightly called out the approach, that education largely is no different from kind of Fordist manufacture. You start at early childhood development, and then you go through primary school, high school, into university, and the outcomes are very different. But it's some of the thinking that we need to do and get on the table and drive a very hard bargain. But there must be leaders listening, and I think that what Sean clearly draws out, some of the same leaders, they are primarily women, leaders who are listening and engaged and taking big decisions. And I was very impressed last year with Kristalina's role at the IMF and how the IMF was able to get resources rapidly onto the African continent, more than any of the predecessors has done. And it changes the way in which we see things, and it tells us what is institutionally possible. Similarly, on the special drawing rights, with Kristalina there, we may have an ally to deal with it. If we can get the world, as represented by the shareholders in the IMF, to understand that the shareholding is based on essentially the size of economies as they existed 75 years ago. The world has moved on. We need to have different criteria to apply. And that is a body of work that isn't adequately articulated. I want to jump onto something else. And you know, part of what excites us is that what Ian calls the FANG economies, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't call it that, but he references it. So I'm not going to credit him with FANG. But what this does is actually to render Maggie Thatcher profound, when she said there's no such thing as society, only individuals. And so everything that we access now is as individuals. We don't interact with other people. And so the power of persuasion is actually limited because very few people can distinguish between fact and fancy on social media. It's part of what I'm hoping Ian's contribution to thinking right now will assist in. How do we break through the way in which we normally respond to these matters?
Big agendas. I think on the education front, it's clear this pandemic has derailed education, but it's derailed all the SDGs by at least 10 years. And actually, the IMF has done some very good work on the costing of this and the implications. And interestingly, it's the IMF, not the World Bank, which should be doing this. The IMF is meant to focus on budgetary matters. The World Bank is meant to be the development institution, but it is really asleep at the wheel compared to the IMF at the moment on this. And but whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's the advancement of gender rights, whether it's in all the other dimensions, certainly income and hunger, this pandemic has been a huge setback for development. I think it's by far the biggest setback that we've seen in our lifetimes, and I'm pretty old, that's happened since the Second World War. So it requires an equivalent jump starting to move things, but not on the same track. Because often they weren't working. And then that's to your point, Trevor, about the old education systems. It's not just that people aren't getting educated, is that what they were being educated wasn't fit for 21st century purpose. And so both things need to happen. People need to be able to catch up and absorb, and that's dramatic, the impact on literacy, particularly of young people that have lost out on primary education or basic, even pre-primary education, to see the lasting impact of these events on the loss of education. But they need to be, we need to learn to teach differently. And I'm very proud to be the chair of a charity called coreecon.org, which is trying to do this in economics, but it needs to happen in many different areas. And I think part of this points to the other side of what you were talking about, Trevor, which is the individual versus collective, I versus we, me rather than us, which has been the long-term impact of not just the Thatcher-Reagan revolution in economics and the idea that everything has a price and that we as individual actors shape our own destiny. It's not up to society, and it's not what we give back that matters, it's what we get that matters. It's not just that, but it's a much broader reversal to a nationalism and a model which is sort of pre-Second World War that worries me. And so many different things have been set back in this. You're right too to point to the fact of these extraordinary women leaders. It's no accident that the countries that have done best with COVID are run by women. It's no accident the countries that have done worse are run by populist men. And the institutions globally that are doing extraordinarily well now, IMF, WTO with Ngozi, I think would be very different to the WTOs before it. That these are very different agendas being set. The question is, will they, as you point to, will they get the shareholder power and will they get the support? And there, I think it's goes back to this point on coalitions. My sense is that we need to not allow the fact that some countries are slowing progress to stop the train. And that means that there need to be other drivers. I think South Africa, as I said, needs to form part of this coalition of new drivers, and there are other countries that are doing this, and make the alternative known. As long as people around the world feel that there's an alternative vision for the future, that there's an alternative energy, that there's widening circles, that even in bad countries, they're great cities and great states. And we saw this under Trump in the US, where California and New York and Illinois were saying, we're going to stick to the Paris Agreement, even though the federal government has pulled out. We see it with companies that are making these commitments and saying, we're going to go beyond, and we're going to, not just do this because of our shareholders or profits, we're going to do it because we think it's the right thing to do. And it's those actions by cities, by states, by governments, that I think provide these coalitions. And part of the challenge we face, particularly for those of us that love the UN and believe in it, is to understand that actually to rely on it is to rely on something which is totally gridlocked. And so unless one creates momentum in other ways, I think we are stuck in the present. And that's really what I'm trying to argue for in Rescue.
But it's also important to look at new coalitions. As you said, the work of the Oxford-Martin Commission has largely been on those coalitions. And I think Kaya's question about preventing the gains made in respect of climate change becomes important in that regard as the world prepares for COP26 this year, ensuring that those coalitions are there. And even at Carbis Bay in Cornwall with the G7, institutions like WWII campaign very heavily for change, and that needs to be ramped up. And we saw citizens movement like Global Citizen organizing concerts and so on. Those kinds of voices need to be part of the coalition. Similarly, Ian, you also draw attention to the impact of stakeholder capitalism and its power in respect of ESG, and ensuring that companies are actually called out for being the polluters and ensuring that polluters pay, and ensuring that governments respond adequately becomes part of this great movement. And I think that these are all the issues that we've got to factor in and understand that too many of our institutions are dated in form and style, and there needs to be something quite different for the future. I want to stop there. Thanks, Marius.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Ian. So colleagues, I'm going to recap here just for a minute as I thank our guests. We started the conversation making reference to Bretton Woods, World War II, the sort of post-World War II international order. And I think it's fair to say that Ian's made a compelling case that the world order is under some strain, that the multilateral and other institutions that constitute that order is under strain, and that's on the basis of the fact that the global systems, whether it's the financial system, which Trevor touched on so eloquently around pensions, whether it's the political system around national populisms or global fractures around new bloc formations, East and West, that those global systems are under strain. And we got into a great conversation around the economic systems, the productive structures, and the social environment in which many find themselves locked into forms of exclusion and unemployment and inequality across these different social divides of race, class, gender, etc. It's been a wonderful conversation, deeply enriching. And I guess if I had to pull out a golden thread that seemed to permeate the conversation, it was this idea of coalitions, global coalitions, intra-state national coalitions, and even subnational interest group-based coalitions. And so perhaps the argument coming out is that there is a need for a new form of institutional response, institutional arrangements that harness citizen action, citizen energy. And perhaps it leaves us with the question, where will the agency and the will and the leadership come from? If not from states and nation states, perhaps it will come from the citizens. Ian Goldin, we want to thank you for your time. A wonderful new book. Looking forward to reading it in more depth. And Trevor Manuel, again, always wonderful having you at GIBS. And then, of course, to our event partners here, Jonathan Ball Publishers and Exclusive Books. And then last but not least, our attendees, GIBS stakeholders and friends. It's always wonderful having you with us on a GIBS forum. We look forward to a future discussion of this kind. And friends, see you soon. Keep safe. Look after yourselves. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.